Welcome to everyone who's joining us just now. I'm Steve Garisher, board member with the Southern California Horticultural Society. And tonight we have with us Kenton Seth, who is a garden designer and author and has co-authored the book, The Crevice Garden with, and I'm going to, Paul Spriggs. And I'm sure we'll hear about this. And the name of the talk is The Modern Crevice Garden, Going West with It. Mr. Seth is based in Colorado, and just before we started the meeting, I spoke with him, and he says he's actually near the Utah border. So I would, from my brief time of going through that area, I would consider that a very challenging climate. I've been through there in August, and I know how brutally hot it can get and dry. So I'm looking forward to this, hearing about this. I actually have I remember when I first started gardening, one of the things I truly wanted to grow, and I'm on clay soil and I still can't do it. So I need to build myself a wall with pockets in it so I can grow. I want to grow capers. And anyway, so and apparently growing capers in a wall is one of the best ways you can grow them. So Mediterranean plants, South African plants, and California natives, all sorts of plants can grow in these situations. So I look forward to hearing this. And so now I give you Kenton Seth.
Thanks, Steve. Let me share my screen. There you go. Thank you guys for hosting me and taking an interest in this poorly named topic. Yeah, so that's what we're here about tonight, is crevice gardening. Yeah, I entitled the talk "Going West with It," since you guys are about as far west as you can go in the lower 48, I think, and you have your own very rich horticulture community down there. And like Alexis told me about your group and how you guys are somewhat interdisciplinary, but all tied to horticulture one way or another. And so I'm glad to finally get to connect with y'all and talk about this stuff. So yeah, I'll just get going with it. Yeah, as Stephen mentioned, full disclosure, I accidentally wrote a book about this nonsense. My buddy Paul there, he's in Victoria, British Columbia, and he's a rock gardening buddy of mine. And I met him 10 plus years ago, 12 years ago now. And halfway through that friendship, both of us realized we should write a book together, because a lot of our peers had told each other independently, you know, in our esoteric little weird corner of the gardening world, which is the rock garden world, there was this need for a consolidated space of the information on crevice gardening. Because back then, 12 years ago, when I saw crevice gardens and did research on them, I had to scrape the far corners of the internet and talk to all 6 people alive who knew anything about it. There wasn't a lot of information. And so we started writing the book 5 years ago, and in process of writing the book, we realized how universal it is. And while we're actively writing the book, it became much more popular worldwide. Thanks to Facebook, etc., we saw more and more of them being built all the time. We witnessed an explosion of them in the US, especially in Colorado, where I'm at, but also from coast to coast. And so literally halfway through the book, we realized the sort of, I hate to overuse the word universal, but the universal quality of crevice garden as a planting system. And in that sort of conceptualizing stage of things, I thought, where does a crevice garden work? And I realized everywhere on Earth, there will be tropical crevice gardens one day. This scheme can be used by anyone. I'm really excited to see what the Japanese do with it, because they're going to just blow it out of the water. They're going to make it its own special art and show everyone how it's done. But early on, I thought, man, California has this rich gardening culture. I feel like you guys have a distinct and powerful region, like the most botanically diverse state. But you also have, a gardening culture to reflect that as well, which is cool. And you guys are way ahead on growing natives. Yeah, and so early on, I predicted, I was like, at some point, California is going to find crevice gardening. That's going to be a hotbed. And I'm happy to report to you, I think that's a little bit true. Because sure enough, a couple years ago, here came an email letting me know that the first public crevice garden in California had been built up north of you at the Tilden Regional Park in Berkeley, more or less there, built by Michael Euler. And he's growing all just Sierra and alpine plants, and especially endemic plants, a focus in that garden, which is very cool. And also the local rock garden chapter up there has their own garden at Lake Merritt. I have a screenshot on the right from their Instagram. So it's happening. It's happening. I understand there's a lot of backyard gardeners, and I've seen some videos online. Thank you, social media, for all the hell you give us, but also the connection. So I've seen a lot of backyard crevice gardens popping up in California. It's fun to see that. And actually, the last talk I gave a year ago to a California group, it was mentioned to me, this crevice garden in your neck of the woods, and I've rudely stolen a screenshot from my friend's blog. Lori Bull writes for Danger Garden. If you don't follow her blog, you're missing out. Really, thanks to her, that's how I know anything about West Coast horticulture from where I'm at, is thanks to her. But yeah, there's this I believe the interpretation there at the museum, they call it a planted wall or a living wall or something like that. But dang it, if I get to be the authority of a book, I'm going to say that is a crevice garden. That's real. So you may have had a public crevice garden in California longer than the one up in Tilden. So it's happening. I think it's only a matter of time before you guys find a way to add your own flavor to crevice gardening and leverage it and make it your own thing. But just to illustrate how out of hand this whole crevice garden thing has gotten, it wound up in the New York Times. No kidding. This was a couple months ago. It was this summer, I think. I remember when my bookkeeper, who's not a gardener, really, she texted me. She says, "Crevice gardening's in the New York Times. Are you serious?" I was like, yeah, it's that nuts. So it's gotten out of hand. Let's just say this poorly named planting systems on the national viewpoint now. But let's reel it back and go way back in time and talk about the history and where it came from. Many of you are probably aware of the culture of rock gardening. It's a subset, just like the iris collectors, the bulb collectors, the rosarians, lavender people, and we are rock gardeners. We have our own magazines. There is a society in every country. There's multiple chapters across North America of them. We have our own style. We're devoted to wild plants and miniatures. It kind of started as an obsession for alpines, but really rock garden plants are anything small, really, that likes to grow in rocks. So it's in that culture that crevice gardening was developed. But the crevice garden as we know it popped up in Prague, oddly enough. So Eastern Europe, and Prague was under Soviet rule at the time. We figure it was somewhere in the 70s or 80s when these Czech guys, who were, basically like well-educated gardeners trapped behind the Iron Curtain with access to just local materials, wanting to grow a biodiverse garden, having small spaces, only having their local mountains to source seeds from, or the rest of the USSR, which is pretty awesome floristically. But these guys, they were venturing to grow their local plants, their chasmophytes, the plants that grow in rock cliffs and grow in just pure rock. And so they were trying to figure out how to grow some of these plants that were really elusive. And I feel, from interviewing some of these folks and going over there, it kind of sounds like there was a love affair with campanulas, maybe, that kind of sparked the idea of squishing two rocks together and then standing them vertically, which is what a lot of people call the Czech system of crevice gardening. But and it just spread from there with the right number of Czech guys that spoke English. They went on tours and they took it to England. They took it to Canada. There was a small book published in England written about it. That was just kind of the bare bones of how to build a crevice garden. And so you see them in botanic gardens. On left, that's Wisley in London. On right, it's a private garden. So, now you're finding them in major botanic gardens around the world. And you might wonder, okay, what the hell is a crevice garden? We just keep like throwing this word around. And to sort of quickly define it for you, it is a rock garden, but it is purpose built to be mostly covered in stone, which is mostly buried for the purpose of growing special plants that like that situation. And so, as you can see from this cutaway illustration, most of the rock is buried, and it's really to accommodate, if not force, a deep root run of plants that want that or appreciate that or will benefit from that in your climate or for their own purposes. And so, it's a rock garden dialed up to 10, right? In my mind, I feel like if there's a spectrum of gardens, that's it. And you might think, how special is a plant that grows in a crack? What are we really trying to grow? And most of us, our first exposure to a crevice plant is dandelions, right? It's a tap-rooted thing that blows on the wind. And it shows up in these places where, that plant, the top half of its root system is probably in road base, a mineral soil. It wants something that's just so nasty, you wouldn't think of planting something in your garden. Which brings up the whole, like, what's this chasmophyte group of plants? What are these plants that must grow in crevices? Who are they really? Are they worth chasing? And there are crevice dwelling plants, rock loving plants around the world, everywhere, literally from the tropics to the tundra. Some of them seem to absolutely require it in garden situations, which is where the crevice garden comes in. And other ones seem to do that in nature for fantastically interesting ecological reasons. And a lot of it's just theoretical because no one's really studied it. Like this Telesonics here, which I have to share it because it's one of my plants. It's from Colorado. And I think, does it also grow in Wyoming? Anyway, it's a relative of Heuchera and with a much showier flower. But it only grows in these granite crevices where it's at. And I feel like this one might be avoiding competition from the subalpine plants down below it at the bottom of the cliff. Like there's lush grass down there and there's pocket gophers and things. But, in the alpine areas, when the top of a mountain is just a cracked rock, where else is a plant going to grow, if it's going to grow there at all, right? So if a plant's going to exist, it has to be in a crevice. But it's not just alpine places that we see chasmophytes. And one of my favorite examples is Petriphytum cespitosum, so creatively named the Petriphytum rock plant, the tufted rock plant. That must have been an early name for cushion forming plants, but that is in the rose family, and it is closely allied to the other spireas. But what I love about it is you will see it in the desert, and you will see it in the montane, and you will see it in the alpine, which I think is really fascinating to point out that you have a plant that grows in each of those very seemingly different places, because I think functionally each of those different places all have the similar stressors going on, whether it's on the top of Mount Whitney or if it's down in Death Valley. It might be drought and exposure that drives plants to these places, but also there's grazing pressures or fire pressures that might give these plants an advantage for growing in cracks like that. So that's, when I say a chasmophyte or a rock growing plant, this is not like a really, really, really super narrow group of plants. It's actually ridiculously wide. And there's a lot of plants that don't need crevices that are everyday plants we have in our gardens. We don't realize in nature they might only be found in crevices. But crevices. What's so important about them? Well, there's a little bit of physics to be talked about. So in a natural situation, like the image on the left, first thing I want to point out is there's no soil, there's no compost, there's nothing remotely similar to what we have in our gardens in that natural situation. It might be a two-dimensional root system. It might be as flat as paper, right? Because those rocks are only literally growing in the crack of a rock. If the plant's really lucky, it gets to grow in gravel, or rock dust. So we have to remember that when we're growing these plants. They don't want, why would they want fertilizer if they have evolved to grow in rocks? Maybe that's why they have, they're particularly prone to fungus and things if grown in the regular garden. Just things to throw out there. But I just wanted to point out the mineral nature and the sort of displaced nature of the root zone for these chasmophytes. Now, in a garden situation, a crevice is a little different. We don't have the luxury of having a mountain in our backyard, so we have to fake it with the crevice garden. But the physics are the same. And I want to point out that there's two different kinds of drainage that we see on a crevice garden. There's the surface drainage, what runs off the top that doesn't soak in, and then that which does soak in. And what's passing through the media in the crevice garden has to go deeper, faster, and further away from the top because it is displaced by these rocks. There's just less avenue for water to travel down. And once it gets down there, it is further away, which could be an advantage, right? In dry climates like ours, which I'll bring up later. But the point is, there's two kinds of drainage going on there, and the roots are really deep. They're forced to be if they're not genetically predisposed to it. Now, another thing happens when you build a miniature mountain range in your front yard is that it has microclimates. Stephen was talking about how a lot of his yard is in north shadow, and so it's shaded most of the winter. And that could be an advantage or a disadvantage. Now, if you have a flat lot and you're not that lucky, building a crevice garden gives you a mountain. And actually, you guys being in LA, you actually probably have a better grasp on microclimates just because of where you are, because you know how the ocean and the mountains affect your local climate, whereas other places might not be quite as aware of how a mountain can change the weather. But in our gardens, I want to point out here, for us, we have this thing called winter where there's snow. You might have seen it on postcards, etc. What the snow is illustrating there for me is that the north side, the snow stays and remains because it doesn't melt off. And much as that might seem cold and inhospitable, it's also a blanket that's insulating plants, and it's also protecting evergreens from being desiccated. And it is effectively completely changing the temperature, summer and winter. So microclimates, a crevice garden creates microclimates. Not only do we have a north side and a south side and an east side and a west side, which all have different temperatures at different times of day and year, but also we have runoff. So on the top of the mound, it's drier, and on the sides, it's more moist. So we instantly have this magnified effect of microclimates just multiplying off of each other, which is very fun. So if you're a plant collector, and I know there's some plant nerds listening, this is a way to have more different kinds of environments for the plants you collect. And really, like, it's these advantages that have made crevice gardening so popular around the globe. These are images from literally all over the world. And they're all kind of in the traditional Czech style with sort of blocky rocks that are vertically arranged and with cracks in between. They're these are traditional crevice gardens here. Except the one on the bottom middle is made out of broken concrete, which we'll talk about a little more later. But that's why you find them. It's not uncommon for the average botanic gardens to not only have a rock garden, but a crevice garden now, because it is a brilliant way to take tiny plants and lift them closer to viewers, thereby making the exhibit a little more effective. How else are you going to see these tiny plants? Like with binoculars walking around? But also it allows growing more plants in a small space and allows botanic institutions to increase their collections. So I have worked with a few botanic gardens where that was their main intent, was just to get their numbers up on the variety of species they have in their plant database. So these are stacking incentives for botanics to have them. The last picture was in Denver. This one's in northern Colorado. But it's not just in Colorado. This one's in New Zealand. I'm going to go back in February and see how things have grown into this crevice garden. But, New Zealand has its own amazing, ridiculous, incredibly cool, like mostly asteraceous and apiaceous alpine flora, just wacky, very cool stuff. And they're going to be able to grow, international alpines, but also a lot of their New Zealand endemics in this crevice garden. Because physics are real everywhere, aren't they? It works everywhere. But a little closer to you, back on the West Coast, up on the Olympic Peninsula, I want to tell just the short story of my friends Kelly and Sue at Far Reaches Farms. Some of you might mail order from them online, but their nursery benefits a plant conservancy. And so they leverage their crevice garden to conserve threatened alpine plants that grow on the Olympic Peninsula. And those plants are threatened with climate change. It's like an island going underwater. There's no place for those alpines to migrate. So that's their intent with this caloptridium down there in the bottom right. And they got so addicted to the first crevice garden, they had Paul and I back this spring, and we added, just 40 more tons of rocks to their giant crevice garden. I'm very excited to see what they do with it in the future. We gave them a lot more north shadows and damp places. I think they're going to be growing ferns that they collected in Southeast Asia, and many of which were new to science, and many of which are just going extinct before they're even discovered because, humanity. Oh yeah, we're reaching 8 billion this week. News flash. Bit of fun. It was fun up there at Far Reaches. Our first copy, our proof of the book came out, and we invited other friends down from Canada, make a build. There was bonfires and booze. It was all very good. Building crevices can be fun. I built this one with my friend Jeremy in North Carolina, and it is at Plant Delights Gardens, which is another mail order I'm sure several of you order from. What's special about it is broken concrete from an old parking pad on site. So they saved a lot of money and resources reusing that concrete when rocks would have been very expensive to buy. And they basically built a retaining wall, but this retaining wall also allowed them to increase their collections and grow plants they never grew before. It was a blast working with Jeremy, and he basically learned everything I told him and then ran with it, and is better at building crevice gardens than me now. And now he's building a lot of them on the East Coast, which is wonderful. He's the preaching the gospel over there. But Plant Delights and the attached juniper level botanic, the thing I noticed that was fascinating is that Mediterraneans don't do very well in the Southeast in the US, and they had always killed most of the Mediterraneans they grow, including your local Zaptionarias. And they planted one when I was there. I wonder if it made it. But because a lot of the true plants from the Mediterranean suddenly were unlocked for them when they built a crevice garden. They were able to grow those Aethionema and the Onchocyclus iris. Teucriums, things they had not been able to do before, suddenly were able to be grown in the drippy, humid Southeast. So that's pretty exciting. Did it all with broken concrete. Hundreds of tons. I think it's technically the largest crevice garden on Earth at the moment, till someone beats them. But it even gained the attention of the Washington Post. It's that big. Marvelous stuff. Broken concrete. I already mentioned how it's a good way to save money, but here I use 2 different soil mixes in each of these old horse troughs. So there's some double recycling going on there. It was this guy's patio, and we turned it into little collector's gardens. And with 2 different soil mixes, he could grow things that wouldn't normally want to grow in the clay that we have to be forced to garden in. So obviously I got interested in crevice gardening 12-ish years ago now. And it was just about the time I started working for myself, and just about the time people started learning about crevice gardens and wanting them themselves. And I was the only moron dumb enough to push rocks for pay back then. So I found myself in this position of being, that was my job because there was a high demand for it. But also because it was brand new, I found myself being an educator suddenly, accidentally, just kind of thrown into it. So I had this whole have crevice gardens will travel shtick going on in the truck. Gosh, that was a good truck. I missed that thing. I was traveling and building crevice gardens all the time, which I still do, just in a much more rational scale these days. And I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't visit any garden center and just not see crevices everywhere. Like even one day I was eating lunch with a friend on a job, and they looked over and they were like, "Do you see what you've just done with your soup?" I was like, I had not seen what I just did with my soup. So I accidentally got steeped in this stuff. Despite being swimming and concentrated crevice gardening all day, and it's not the only thing I do. I work with natives and meadows and other garden design. Despite being saturated in crevice gardening, I'm still finding new things that are fun, and still getting to do new things every time I put in a new crevice garden, like these steps. Like I'd seen the Czech fellows do this over there in Czechia, formerly the Czech Republic. I'd seen the step thing, and I was waiting for a good time to do that, and that was an opportune time. And there are now plants self-sowing into those crevices where they get stepped on, which is fun. But a lot of these examples I showed you are huge. They're monstrous. You need heavy equipment or crowbars or a good back or a young person with a good back to move things for you. It doesn't have to be that way. My friend Tony's troughs here are hypertufa or concrete. I think they're concrete. But the largest of those stones are the size of like a medium dinner plate, right? And he's able to grow draba, which is a brassicaceous alpine plant, which are worldwide. There's even some South American ones, Austrodraba or something. Anyway, draba is this huge genus, and Tony, just because he loves them, he might have accidentally had the largest collection of draba on Earth just in these little troughs right here, in little crevice gardens, because the crevice garden still works even if it's in a container that's only a foot wide by 18 inches. One of the friends that came to help us build the Far Reaches Garden Annex this spring was Chris, this impossibly handsome fellow. He posts on social media all the time of these, what I like to call these bonsai mountains or bonsai cliffs he's building in these tiny little pots that he keeps on his porch in Victoria. I'd like to see, I'm sure it's going to happen. I will enjoy watching more of these sort of balcony artists create these miniature mountain ranges. I just love that stuff, because small spaces are a good place for crevice gardens. This is my friend Trina's crevice garden, which actually I'm going to go see her tomorrow. We're going to annex them. She's addicted to them. But she placed this crevice garden off her patio because it was this awkward spot where her vegetables wouldn't grow anymore. There were too many tree roots. It was getting a little too shady. The soil was getting tired, and it was right there, and it was very visible, right next to her patio where she eats all the time. And that's one of the gardens that made me realize that crevice gardens fit in these awkward spots. There's that weird step next to your garage door. There's always those awkward places, especially ones where there's some topography change. And I think a crevice garden is very often just the perfect solution, because they're very often spots that are close to where you are. And so small plants are visible and I think appropriate when they're really close. I mean, you can see a bush, right? You can see a ceanothus from 20 feet away, but one of these tiny little bellflowers or saponarias, or even just the sempervivums, that are only 2 or 3 inches wide, they need to be closer. So it's a nice way to turn that awkward spot into something beautiful. And I do want to point out too that crevice gardens don't always have to be this vertically, placed, and it doesn't always have to be slabby, but here's a diagonal placement. That construction process is a little different. And for us in the Intermountain West, this is what geology looks like. So a diagonal lean just feels more natural to us if that's the goal we're going for. So John's garden here on the other side of Colorado is a great example of that, because he really unlocked the pattern for how to build the crevice garden in a diagonal way, and it working out, because early versions didn't go so well for some horticultural reasons. But yeah, they don't have to be vertical. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and the rocks don't have to be square or flagstone shaped either. My friend Dom has the best example of the round rock crevice garden. He handpicked these stones from a glacial moraine in the mountains of Colorado. So these are polished by glaciers, and he picked the best rocks because they were handpicked one at a time and put in the back of his car. But what I love about this is it points out you can still have a crevice garden if you have round stones. The main difference is that you just can't build them quite as tall if that was the thing you're going for. And your crevices are no longer these sliver shapes anymore. They're funny, like triangles and starfish shapes, and funny amoebic shaped planting pockets. But the physics are still the same. You still have that warm surface and that cool bottom and the underneath where the roots are. So he's growing his alpine plants just brilliantly in this moraine garden. And sometimes that, round stones look more appropriate in a garden than something, ledger-like. Crevice garden doesn't even have to look like nature, right? It doesn't have to look like a cliff or a mountain range. It could look like this. This is at the Utrecht University, and with Dutch innovation, and they didn't have a great budget, but they had a big alpine plant collection. They built these crevice spheres out of broken concrete pavers. Because after all, like, Holland doesn't have any natural rocks. Half the country is not even supposed to be above water if we were going to talk about what nature wants, right? So I thought this was an awesome innovation. And also they take the microclimates and give you the whole way. There are plants on the north side of that literally never see sun, only light. So that's exciting. That's a bit of fun. And this just sparked a lot of people's imaginations. I do love that. Swinging on the exact opposite side was my design at the Cheyenne Botanic Gardens. Their local stone gave me an opportunity to try to go very naturalistic and not have that really vertical look. Because of the context. It was surrounded by human-made things. There's sidewalks, parking lots, buildings, glass, brick, all these very hard things. And yet I was hired to bring in more hard and heavy things and rocks. And so I thought it was important that this design was something soft and natural. So, when the plants are young, that's this image here. That's us building it, just giving you an idea of the fact that some stones are incredibly large and many of them are very small. So that full range is part of the key of creating a natural, very nature-made crevice garden. There's a lot of construction tricks to make them look natural as well. But once they were full of their plants, then that really softened the site and it became much more inviting, I think, than having all those hard things when you enter the garden. And then you get this nice play of transparent plants with hard rocks. But variety. Take a little diversion and take a quick tour back to Europe. This is in the Czech Republic, but the story very much includes German ecological or habitat gardening. It's kind of a new thing in the States, I feel. There's new organizations that are like habitat gardeners and big books coming out and all. But in Europe, they've been doing it for a long time. They've been doing it a lot longer than we have. It's just reflected in the culture of how they grow plants and how they talk about plants in their gardens. But I visited this fellow way out in the country in the Czech Republic, and this is a garden. It is very much a habitat garden. He wanted to make a garden that was not just for him, but for beaver and for fish and for turtles and for frogs. And so that's what he's gardening for. And when Paul and I visited this guy, it was the first time I saw a legless lizard. The guy, we're walking around the garden looking at daphnes, and there's this fox following us while we were looking at his garden, and no one seemed to care or notice. And before I could ask the translator, like, there's a fox, what's going on with this fox following us? Before I got to ask that, the fox runs up in his arms and he just continues talking about daphnes while he's holding this baby fox. The point is, the guy's hardcore. Then in winter, the guy goes down in the basement, and on the bottom right, those are not pinned butterflies. Those are wood carve butterflies that he paints to look very realistic. And why I talk about all this wildlife gardening stuff and notice there's water and there's trees creating diverse habitat. He got into rock gardening because he wanted to attract scarab beetles, which are endemic to the steppe of Eastern Europe. And sure enough, he actually attracted some of those beetles by building a steppe habitat garden. Because I think crevice gardens fit into that. They are the missing ecology in gardens reflecting natural habitat, if you will. It's a very long sentence. If our lawn is kind of a crappy prairie or meadow, and our trees that we have in our cities are sort of crappy forest, I'm saying crappy because they're artificial, and maybe, they don't have all the ecological services of a real forest. And, maybe we're pouring pesticides on our lawns as well. But the point is, a lot of what we build somewhat reflects nature. And I think that is where gardening is moving now. I think garden design is moving towards this sort of habitat or ecology or archetypical biome-based design. And so crevice gardening gives us the rocky places on Earth, because there are rocky places all over, from the pole to the tropics. And when we build rock gardens, here come the animals, right? That want those things. Obviously, it's like snakes, lizards, and spiders are the first things to show up because they like being warm in the rocks and they start eating your pests. That's cool. And then this one I wanted to point out, this is the Western pygmy blue butterfly. It is the world's smallest butterfly, and it occurs in Western North America and down to Argentina, I think, and it just became an invasive species in the Middle East. You can't make this stuff up. But the point is, habitat gardening is cool. There's amazing critters to learn about, and crevice gardens are a way that we get more of them. In the upper left, that is a day-flying moth I just learned about this year called a police car moth. Real name. On the right side, you have this white form of the crab spider or the floral spiders that attack pollinators that are coming into the flowers, and they'll usually try to reflect the flower in their camouflage. And then on the bottom left is a hole of some mysterious critter that made its burrow in my crevice garden last year. Don't know what it was. It's a lot bigger than the other insects, but turns out a lot of native bees like that dry place and they like that mineral soil. And then it gives us a chance to grow plants that might attract additional or specific pollinators. It's that missing place that I think our gardens have needed for a while, is having those rocky places. So I want to kind of sum up some of the variety of ways that crevice gardens have been used or can be used, and then point us to some more new ones that are more appropriate for you and I in the dry Western US. But the awkward pockets, we talked about those weird places, including retaining walls. Like, you can have another wall, you could just have another engineered soil retaining wall built in its traditional way, or you could have a freaking garden. Like, choose, what do you want, garden or wall? So I think a crevice garden is an awesome replacement for a retaining wall. And I'm seeing that take a lot of traction in the last year with new institutions building them. I talked about special plant collections. That was obviously the birth of crevice gardening, was trying to grow funky plants. But now we're starting to see crevice gardens as a conservation tool for ex situ conservation, when we can't save the habitat anymore with climate change threatening the tops of mountains. There's the concrete disposal, which I'll talk about a little more later. And I just harped to you about wildlife. There's also a low maintenance use and a dry use in where we live that I want to get into. But before I get too deep into that, I want to make a quick point about the plant origins, like what makes a rock garden plant. There is no fine line about that. Over the years, more rural loving people have literally written stuff like 12 inches. If it's taller than 12 inches, it's not a rock garden plant. Get it out. It shouldn't be allowed. Does it come from a rocky place? I don't know. There is no line. Plant what you like. It's fine. But the main thing I think we have to keep in mind is where plants come from. Like, a lot of miniaturized plants are miniature for different reasons. On the upper left, we have the mountains, right? So the tops of mountains above tree line, there's a special set of stressors making the plants miniaturized. They're getting cold. There's a short growing season. They have things messing with them there. Similar stuff is happening on the coast, but there it might be salt spray, and it might be cloudy winters, and it might be incredible wind that's keeping the plant short, even though the coastline is nowhere near tree line, right? Until it goes and meets it up at the tundra. Lower left is the steppe biome, which is important to us in Colorado, because I think we've only just realized that a lot of Colorado is steppe. That important treeless but not arid ecosystem that covers so many parts of Earth. But then lastly, there's the desert, the good old-fashioned desert. You guys are not far from some proper American deserts, just over the mountains from you. And those are obvious. They're characterized by just drought. It's hot and it's dry. And that makes a desert a desert. And so when the plants come from those different places, it doesn't mean that all of them necessarily want to grow together in a rock garden. That said, they very often do. And you'll see folks growing a desert plant next to an alpine plant, which is always a funky, fun thing to just think about how that's pulled off. But, if you have a xeric garden and you're not watering it, probably not going to grow alpine gentians in it, but never say never. Just wanted to point that out. Plant origins, try to be aware of where your plants come from. So therefore what they want. I know you guys, since you're in truly a Mediterranean climate, you are deeply aware of the fact that you are part of the Mediterranean and related climates. So let's talk dry gardening. Let's talk the future of that. We all know where things are heading in terms of dryness, drought, and heat and stuff in the dry and intermountain and western US. And so gardeners are having to respond in some communities. It's literally illegal to use culinary water to water your plants. In other places, it's just too damn expensive, and they don't even put spigots on houses anymore, or they're ripping up turf, right? In other places like Colorado, we still have tons of water and we're wasting all of it as we run out of it. But many gardeners getting wise to it. This is all leading up to the first public project that I ever did. Again, not because I'm particularly good at these things. I was just the only fool who was willing to do it. Is at a Parks and Rec complex in a suburb of Denver that I was asked to design and build a crevice garden. And it just made sense that it was the first all xeric, all crevice garden that's public. And so that's what we did. And the story starts and ends with a watercolor, because none existed before then. I had to draw something to explain to the powers that be what I was going to build for them, and came up with this shoddy little watercolor. And fast forward 4 years, and a friend would come to visit it, and she would draw her own watercolor, which was much more beautiful, of the garden itself and things growing up in it. We call it the Apex Crevice Garden. It's a 3,000 square foot area. It is sandwiched awkwardly between a parking lot and pickleball courts. So it is in a weird place with weird background. And it gets tons of traffic, and the local people love it because it's where they get their exercise every day. And I learned a lot of things about this garden, or learned a lot just by building the garden. and luckily things worked out because it was first of a kind in many ways. But what we discovered is in an irrigation setup of just being watered once every 2 weeks, we could still have a massive plant palette from alpines to drylanders from all over the world. So, going through origins here of plants in the picture, we've got a penstemon from the Alamo in Texas. We've got a paintbrush from the plains. We got a Texas yucca. We've got a Wyoming penstemon. We have a Utah erigeron, a Patagonian cactus there on the lower left. Moltkia in the middle is from the Balkans. Grass on the right is from the Edwards Plateau, and that little blue haze is an acantholemon from Turkey. You guys probably grow acantholemons. If you don't, you must. Badass Mediterranean and Eurasian plants. Incredible, beautiful cushion plants. And there's a manzanita back there even, too, just to call to you guys. The point is, it is a dryland rock garden plant growing machine, and it's very low maintenance. Yeah, it actually worked out. And maybe at the time when I created, I might not have known exactly what was going on, but a couple things happen here. So because the surface is drier, we have less weeds. Because there's no compost involved, there's not an overabundance of nutrients. So we have less productive soils, less weeds. And so all the plants stay nice and miniaturized, and we don't have to prune as often. And it also just sheds organic material, falling leaves, twigs, flower petals, whatever, decay, that stuff blows away off of the garden. And so for something that's, very expensive and intensive to build, and you're burying all these rocks, it's weirdly low maintenance. It's just, I would say that it's skilled maintenance. 1 year I counted, and cumulatively only 15 hours were spent taking care of this garden. And what's more, not only is it less time, but also when you're deadheading or removing dead plants or weeding or whatever, you don't have wheelbarrow fulls of plants. You have like handfuls of plants. So strangely enough, crevice gardens are being used deliberately by some gardeners who know, hey, I'm getting older. I'm not going to be able to carry heavy stuff as often. Now all my plants are going to be miniaturized and they're going to be lifted closer to me. So there are folks building crevice gardens just because they'll be lower maintenance, as they go into retirement. And, it's not just because you might be losing mobility. It might be because you want to go on vacation and not be married to a garden that needs coddling all the time. The point is it worked. And remarkably exotic holy grail plants from the rock gardening world, like this Petunia patagonica. I think it's been split into Nurembergella, whatever. Genetics, might not be a petunia anymore, but it's a little evergreen shrub from Patagonia. Comes from a brutally windy place, and it grows beautifully in the Apex Crevice Garden, which was that was a treat. It's also just an eriogonum machine. It can grow eriogonums like no other garden I've had. Usually those things don't live very long, but they lived a lot longer in that garden. And I think it's because of that mineral soil or that mineral media and the low water. It just keeps them going a lot longer. So now you've heard me yammer on for a while. It's time to just look at some plant pornography here. Of the dryland plants, these are a selection of dry growing and zone 5, maybe colder even. Zone 5 maybe for hardy plants, in case anybody's way up in the hills in California there. Like the stenotus. Yeah, we've got Asteraceae, we've got the parasitic paintbrush. I also point these out because at least, not all of these plants necessarily need crevices in nature, but some of them do grow in crevices in nature. But for me, I kind of see them as like they're sort of staple, sort of bread and butter for the dry crevice garden. And like Echinocerius, man, let's like on the lower left. So that's my endemic form of Echinocerius triglycidiatus, which is now mojavensis, blah, blah, blah. The form inermi, it's this spineless one we have growing near us here in Western Colorado. So it's, it's my local, like my mascot, right? And I love the thing. And I also just love oranges and reds, so whatnot. But you guys, where you're at, you don't have that winter thing. You could grow all the Echinocerius. There's a bunch of non-hardy ones from Mexico. All these amazing whack jobs in every dang color that God created. I feel like it's a matter of time before in Southern California and Arizona, like Southern Arizona, that crevice gardens are leveraged to be Echinocerius growing machines, honestly. Man, I just can't get enough of those. Yeah, this picture's for me. You guys are just along for the ride. Sorry about that. I cannot get enough of that. I can't wait till April. It's good stuff. But not just Echinocerius, like the snowball cacti. There's probably a botanist watching who's going to shake their finger and say that's actually Escobaria lei, and I think it might be. But you guys can grow even more of the Mexican species, which are these miniature balls. And even though they don't require a crevice, it is a nice way to lift them up away from other plants that might eat them. And it's a real fun way to display them in the garden. And I think like they're the ultimate plant for the highest and driest crevice. So very often, if it's the right time of year, what I'll do is just take a cutting from one of these plants and shove it in a new crevice garden and let it root out. And that way I can exploit some of the tighter crevices with something decorative like that plant. And I have to point out, I'm an agave lover and a collector, and I can only grow like half a dozen species because it gets freaking cold here. And you guys can grow just everything. You have your own, endangered endemic one down there on the Mexico border, don't you have it? You're going to grow all the agaves. Well, a lot of agaves, when I went on a big plant hunting trip, I realized a good chunk of the agaves are chasmophytes, like natural rock and crevice plants in nature. They don't require them in gardens by and large, unless you're growing them in England and it's been done. Yes, they're growing agaves now in London by putting them in high crevices. But I just want to point that out. That's one of those plants. A lot of agave species are chasmophytes, be they hardy or non-hardy ones. And I know you guys have a couple evil misms out there of the ice plant family, but I also know you guys are probably collecting a lot of the other fun ones. Man, South Africa is such a treasure trove. more than anyone of any of the rock garden or the garden cultures in America, what Africa has. For you guys can grow aloes and all this fun stuff. And newsflash, a lot of them are from crevices, or crevice garden is a good way to grow them. So these are ones that are just hardy for us. So I get all excited about them, but you can grow your lithops and you can grow all the other species and genera I've never heard of. And I know for a fact there are plant collectors in your area with crevice beds in their backyards for collections of lithops and things like that. So, there's future in that. There's potential for growth. And what's more, even if we move completely away from plants entirely, in a xeric garden setting or a xeriscape setting, just having something special in a landscape that's a fun, an element of design, or a what would you say, like it's a an object, like an objet d'art or whatever. Being able to have a thing like that is important to us, I think, especially in places where we can't water our gardens anymore. And so I have this image here is a crevice garden that is barely even planted yet. And I want to point out that even without plants, it could be something we can use, because sooner or later we're going to be deprived of using turf and fountains and water features and things like that. So I see that happening where I'm at, where more and more people are becoming water conscious with their landscapes. So just want to put that bug out there that it's artistically, rock gardens and crevice gardens are a great opportunity for us. They don't have to look natural. Again, I'll bring this one up again. This is a recycled concrete crevice garden I did because the driveway that was demolished was cut cleanly with a grinder, leaving me these very square stones, or not stones, pieces of concrete. And so I kind of had to build cubes, which might be more appropriate in a city setting. This is a water demonstration garden that goes unirrigated. And I was trying to attract the creatures I was trying to bring into the garden were hipsters, because it was the succulent trend. And so I tried to use kind of flashy succulents that would look good against them. But there's a little more potential for crevice gardening in cities and with concrete. There's not really time to dive into the long history of rock gardening, but it has historically been a thing of landed gentry. And it's, rock gardening has been, like, I'll just be frank, it's been colonial. It was its start. I think there's this wonderful opportunity now for broken concrete or recycled concrete crevice gardens to bring rock gardening into the hands of people, everyday people, because there are places on earth where rocks are scarce or expensive to get, especially inner cities. But recycled concrete not only has an ecological side to reusing this material, which is expensive to haul off and fill landfills with, but it's a material that's available to everyone now. It levels the playing field. So a small botanic gardens that's underfunded, or a community garden, or just a gardener who's broke, can have a rock garden. And I really want to lean into that. I feel like that's a thing we need to work on. So I'm putting this call out to you guys. I'm doing this in many talks nowadays, is if you know of a local nonprofit or a local small garden, a community garden, or even just an activist or advocate or somebody like that who needs a crevice garden book, I have just a little bit left of a grant that we got to give free books to such entities and institutions. So if anybody fits that bill, send a message. We'd love to send them a book to show them how to build crevice gardens, and then they'll take it and run with it and show us how to do it. It's going to be great. Just wrapping up, there are some final new, most recent, iterations of crevice gardening that is approaching it from masonry, like at Denver Botanic Gardens. First time we know of this happening. They built it from the inside out, and it's mortared together, and they squeegeed in clay as the media. Yup. It is the crevice garden built as masonry. I cannot wait to see more of those. you think hybridizing crevice gardening with a roof garden would be the worst idea ever, because I did. And then Peter in Sweden at Coauthored did this and showed us that there could be hybrid vigor in the cross of these two planting systems, and it makes both of them better. So these aren't rocks on the roof. This is UV stabilized styrofoam. And the reason why this is so cool, and this is such a brilliant, badass, clever solution, is that roof gardens tend to be limited by only growing shallow rooted plants. When you make a crevice garden now, you can grow deeper rooted plants. There's meadow plants in there now. There's tall grass prairie plants in there. And also it's insulating the roof now, which is making the roof garden even better. So I just love that. That's very cool that there's a synergy here. And we're probably going to see, because this is such a flipping good idea, we're probably going to see a lot of styrofoam roof crevice gardens in the future. I predict that. I said it today. We'll see what happens in the future. And in my own humble little world, I'm just personally interested in this interplay of meadow plants or forbs, herbaceous plants, grassy areas, and the crevice garden. In a garden setting, usually a meadow garden, like you guys have John Greenlee out there, usually the meadow garden and the rock garden disagree with each other. They have different maintenance, different plants. They don't necessarily get along, but I really enjoy that tension, and I enjoy sort of recreating that effect that we see in nature all the time. So that's sort of my current obsession. It also lets me mix plants that wouldn't normally be mixed, rock garden plants and meadow plants together. It's fun. And I get to see interplays of translucent plants against the hardness of rock, which are completely different and dynamic and artistic and all of that. So that's what keeps me busy these days. And with that basically wraps it up. I wanted to leave you guys on a final slide because my publisher tells me I have to push the book. It's available from any of your favorite online booksellers. But I also wanted to point out, and I realized that some of my favorite plants to grow in the crevice garden are from California, like that sexy coyote mint, Monardella macrantha, that everyone's so excited for here. That's from your neck of the woods. That is the wackiest mint I've ever seen. And if I'm allowed in my own little plant farm to expose my favorite Zauschneria, I'm sorry, I'll probably die before I call them epilobiums. Everett's Choice is I think it's a hybrid, but it's mostly septentrionalis. So it's not a xeric, but it's a much smaller plant and won't reseed all over your garden and swallow it up. But that's, like commercially available Californian plants that are appropriate for a crevice. That's, I wanted to leave you with that. And also you can screenshot this. This is also a list of some plant sources, because that's always a big question that comes up, is where you get these things. So with that, that is the end of my talk. And I guess we go to questions, don't we?
Yes, questions. Thank you so much for that talk. It was amazing. If anyone has questions, go ahead and put them either in the chat or in the Q&A, and we can start answering some of those. We have one question right now. Curious as to how gritty the fill soil should be.
So that could be a very nuanced question depending on what you're growing, where you're growing it, and if you're irrigating or not. But the basic answer is that when you introduce a new media to your garden and you're using it in the rock garden situation, it just needs to be a little grittier or a little looser than your existing soil. That's all. So if you have clay, cool, you can use anything. If you have sand, then I would probably recommend using that same sand actually on top, because sand, drains so well, so famously. So really, I don't know, I hate to sort of punt that one, but it depends on what you're growing. Weirdly enough, like as the book was going to press is when I really started feeling confident about the fact that nowadays in the West, just generally in the West, especially dry places, we're just using rock dust. We're using crusher fines. Locally, we call it decomposed granite. But they were doing it in Europe. That guy with the fox, he had a big mound in his garden and he called it rotten granite, is what he said it was. So just rock dust, pure rock dust, like nothing else, has weirdly been a good media for rock gardens. That said, if you're trying to grow columbines and things that are hungrier, maybe you have to add compost as well, but just grittier than what you have in the soil around you. I hope that's a good answer there. Let's see, I read this one from Laura. Can you talk a little more about watering needs? Again, it depends on the plants that you're growing. Containers will always be more water than the ground. I have a few unwatered containers and they are only cactus because, well, it's dry around here. Indeed, Colorado the mountains and upland places does get more summer rain, and Denver does. Where I'm at, I actually have the same precipitation as you, just a little less. You guys have about 12 inches and I have about 9. And then I have winter. So it depends on the plants you're growing. If it's native plants, I really love not watering, which I think is a little more common out where you guys are at. And it's like a completely foreign concept to Coloradoans, because we just believe that literally nothing can grow without water. And yet we go hiking every day and don't notice all of the plants that are out there without irrigation. So deep and frequent has been, the favorite of a lot of people. If you're growing alpines, not more than twice a week, because alpine plants usually get like afternoon thunderstorms constantly. So yeah, it really does depend on what you're growing. And I tend to hydrozone things in a very simple calendar way. The average of my own gardens, I don't water more than once a week, and I can grow a lot of moisture loving stuff that way. The Apex garden is watered with overhead irrigation, big droplets on rotors, which is new modern inventions. That's watered once every 2 weeks. And with those rotors that put out big droplets, they put out a little bit of water at a time. And so they actually have to be on for a long time because they don't put out a great volume at once. So compensate for that if you're irrigating that way. I hope I didn't answer too much on that. Yeah.
All right, we have a couple more. So Carol's asking, how do you distinguish a crevice garden from a rock garden?
That's a good question. Ever to the person believing there's no fine line on the things, there isn't a fine line, except a crevice garden's purpose built to using the crevices to grow plants in it. And when Paul and I wrote the book, we realized we have to make some actual rules. And so we defined it as the majority of the soil surface is covered by rocks. And in that way, the plants will interact with the rocks and it will affect them. When there's less than half of the soil surface covered in stones and the stones are really far from each other, the physics just doesn't happen to do much and doesn't benefit the plant. So it's not really functioning. And then it's a rock garden at that point. But in the realm of naturalistic crevice gardens, I really like an edge of it to blend so that a crevice garden starts to fade away and become just kind of a rock garden. And then it can become an open soil planting bed there. Hope that answers that. See, I see one where Kathleen asks what kind of rock was in Trina's patio covers. That is a Dakota Formation sandstone from northern Colorado. The quarry is out, so it doesn't exist anymore, that quarry, but the Dakota Formation is really common throughout the West. It's just a, oh golly, is it Jurassic or Cretaceous? But it's one of those really high oxide yellow and red stripy things. I'm sure there's other, types, similar looking stones in California.
And I see there's another question from Carol saying some plants are restricted to specific rock outcrops, for example, limestone endemics. Have you found that these endemics will grow in other rock types as well?
Weirdly, we've not noticed plants really requiring the rock that they come from. By and large, they don't seem to care. The exception being in climates with acid soils, when they're trying to grow lime-loving plants, the limestone will help. I haven't seen it yet, but some of us have wondered if concrete will do the same thing, because concrete, some of us have joked, concrete is Anthropocene limestone. It is very high in lime, and there's a good chance that it does affect the rhizosphere of the plant enough to make that happen. We have not pinned that down. We have not seen concrete actually doing it yet. I don't have the evidence yet, but we do know of rock gardeners, especially in Europe, who are growing calcareous loving plants in their acidic soils using limestone. So yeah, that one's the one exception.
Okay, great. And we have a few more. Are there any weeds that are a particular problem?
That is a great question. So in crevice gardens, generally, I also want to note pests. By and large, a lot of pests go away because they're not attracted to the situation, just not as good, and the plants aren't as lush, except ants. Ants love the rocks and they make their burrows under them. Same for weeds. That drier, lean media, since it's not actually soil, it just really dispels a lot of the weeds, except the exception is wind-blown taprooted plants seem to be the weeds that can come in. So dandelions, frankly, things, or salsify. I'm sure you guys have stuff out there I don't even comprehend. And the other one would be if you didn't clear rhizomatous plants with really deep rhizomes that spread. If you didn't clear those out before you built the crevice garden, those will obviously go underneath of the rocks and just give you a real headache. So that's a major consideration when siting, especially big crevice gardens. If there's like a field of, oh golly, I'm trying to think of the rhizomatous grasses out in your area. They are not coming to me, but you know what I mean. Sod forming and deep rooted things. Oh, Bermuda grass. Yeah, especially Bermuda grass with deep rhizomes. Like keep that crap away from a crevice garden because it will. I have seen a crevice garden get swallowed by Bermuda, and it was a bummer. Yeah, there we go. Laura preempted it there. Yeah, but really weirdly enough, and it's just a different suite of weeds will show up, and it's fewer of them, like the crevice garden. Weirdly enough.
All right, and I just see, I know you kind of already answered about the rock placement. So one last question. Have you ever worked with difficult stone like serpentine?
Oh, I have not had the pleasure of working with serpentine. I think that'd be novel and funky. Difficult stone. I have a sculpture background. That's what my degree is in. And my thesis was on how you could look at art as problem solving. This is kind of digressing a little bit, but so when I have a weird rock, I just see that, limitations force you, it forces you to pick a theme. And so I kind of embrace challenging stone. I think it's good. And then to work with it and not try to do things with it doesn't want to do. So I wouldn't say that I've worked with like real hard, tricky stone. Like serpentine would obviously, I'm assuming would exclude plants around it like it does in nature. We don't have it naturally occurring in Colorado that I know of. But, and actually like the cut concrete in those perfect rectangles, that was one of the weirdest things where I looked at that and I was like, what am I going to do with this? Like, I just never done anything like that before. That was a real head scratcher. And I like the project lagged a whole day because I did not expect the material to come that way. But I don't know. I was happy with what came out of it. I don't know. Rocks that fracture that are really soft, like mudstones, that'd be a bummer if you built a crevice garden out of that and it all fell apart. Yeah, I don't know. No, actually, so Sean Hogan up at Sistis Nurseries, he tells me he has plans. Jeremy and Paul and I built him, mostly Jeremy, built him a crevice garden this spring. And he's going to go out and get serpentine rocks and going to try plants around it. So I guess stay tuned. It'll be fun. So see, there's a frontier yet for home gardeners to experiment with. Oh, very cool. It's been done already. Yeah, very cool.
And we have actually one more question if that's not too many.
Of course, yeah.
Could you expand on vertical versus diagonal stones? You said it has a large botanically different effect.
Yeah. So when the first Czech crevice gardener came to Colorado in 1986, the month I was born, And he talked about crevice gardens. It didn't really resound with a lot of Coloradans because the rocks standing on end just looked weird. And folks didn't really love the look. They thought it was artificial because in Denver, like a lot of their nearest rock outcroppings are diagonal. If anyone's been to Denver, like Red Rocks, the famous amphitheater there, is all this formation that's this diagonal look. And so a few gardeners built these diagonal ones. What happened was the rocks didn't touch each other, and so they kind of compacted the soil between them, and then the soil ran out if it didn't get compacted. So the plants did not love it, and those gardens didn't do super well. I hate to say it that way, but like ultimately the gardeners were creative and found plants that wanted to grow there, but they weren't. It's not like it unlocked new plants for them. It wasn't great. But what John figured out was that he propped the rocks up on each other because they're all leaning into one another. And then weirdly, when you build a diagonal crevice garden, you have to start from one side to the other. You have to start with the bottom rocks and work backwards, which is really tricky. Honestly, I find that hard. Like you have to like memorize where you're going with it and ration your stones as you go in order to create the environment that doesn't mess with the plants. The other funny thing horticulturally that happens is because we're irrigating to reproduce rain, or we're just letting it rain for our irrigation, so imagine stones that are slab-like. We're going to get, instructive here with the cell phone. If a slab is longer that way, that means when it rains, more of the water accumulates on one side than the other. So now you have a dry side and a wet side, which I haven't seen yet someone to truly leverage that to the best of its abilities to grow really dry growing plants on one side and the more moisture living plants on the other. But that potential also exists. I think there's horticultural, another frontier there for the diagonal method. So yeah, we have, there's a page in the book about how to build diagonally. And I thought that was important, even though there are some more dogmatic folks who are like, it's not a crevice garden if they're diagonal, but I'll go to bat for you if you go diagonal.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kenton. This was such a great talk. And lastly, we are going to be giving away a copy of your book, The Crevice Garden.